Chapter 3. And this is relevant to your reward. What reward would that be? So, Paul, after going on at length about there being an eternal reward, now he goes on about how that reward will be determined. He goes on about a process involved in determining that reward. He goes on about some sort of fire. A fire which Roman Catholics call purgatory. You may have heard of that before. Purgatory is what they call it. Protestants don't believe in it. They call it purgatory. A fire which Rome says is physical, and it's intended to purge our sinful story. To purge our sinful human story just prior to entering that heavenly glory. A literal understanding that Calvin calls absurd, silly trifles, and endless fictions. And it's an understanding which Luther was first to take issue with against Rome. And this is what upset Luther. There was this guy who kept making the rounds. His name was Tetzel. Coins! I need coins! And he would say. And people would put coins in his coffer. It was probably a metal cup or something of that nature. Coins! And he had some sort of a phrase there that he would plead for coins. Well, you see, he was sent out by Rome. He was sent out by the Pope to raise funds to build the Vatican. Yeah, we need a bigger Vatican. So the Pope sent him out. Tetzel, you got to earn some more money. We got this new doctrine called purgatory. We think you can earn some money with it. So, here you got Tetzel going, coins! As soon as a coin in the coffer rings, a soul from purgatory springs. Oh yeah, I'm going to get my parents out of hell. Here, take 2 of them. Have 2 coins. Made a lot of money. Luther was upset about that. He was furious. So when he nailed a thesis on the door, 500 years ago, that was his first issue. He was angry about that one, about Tetzel and the Pope defrauding people of their money and that, with that false doctrine, with that foolishness of purgatory. And I go on to say how this is figurative language, proving that this is figurative language, that this is not literal fire. Okay, you can follow the language on and on, whatever. However, I go on to say this is a metaphorical fire, figurative fire, and this metaphorical fire will reveal what you did with your faith. We'll see that in next chapter when I explain what that criteria is. That fire will reveal a spiritual value which determines how close you will be with Christ in heaven. Huh? Yes. There is no greater reward than being increasingly close to Christ. Which reminds me of a John Wesley illustration. John Wesley was a guy back in the 1700s who was huge preacher in England. Enormous. He would travel around doing all sorts of tent revivals and whatnot. Major preacher traveling all around. And highly respected preacher. and another guy at the same time. His name George Whitefield, and he did a lot of traveling sermons as well in England and America, where he actually stayed with Jonathan Edwards for a while. Because he was a Calvinist, just like Jonathan Edwards was. But George Whitefield died, and then John Wesley was asked a question by one of his parishioners. And I'm going to ask my wife to help me with this little dialogue here. And you can be the wife asking John Wesley the question, okay? Well, yes. Just one day after Whitefield's decease, he died, John Wesley was timidly approached by one of the godly band of Christian sisters who had been brought under his influences and who loved both Whitefield and himself.
Dear Mr. Wesley, may I ask you a question?
Wait a minute, I guess you brought him. Yes, of course, madame, by all means.
But dear Mr. Wesley, I'm very much afraid of what the answer will be.
Well, madam, let me hear your question, and then you will know my reply.
Mm-hmm. At last, after not a little hesitation, the inquirer tremblingly asked, Dear Mr. Wesley, do you expect to see this dear Mr. Whitefield in heaven?
No, madam.
I was afraid that was what you were going to say.
To which John Wesley then added with intense earnestness, Do not misunderstand me, madam. George Whitefield was so bright a star in the firmament of God's glory, and will stand so near to the throne that one like me, who am less than the least, will never catch a glimpse of him. Boom. So, even though the theology there might be a little bit skewed, I'm sure they loved each other dearly, and they will both see each other face to face in heaven and laugh about that. So, once again, we'll discuss how that criteria will be determined next week. But Paul begins this chapter by speaking to those soggy Christians again. Soggy because they like being soggy, because they wanted milk and not solid food, is what was discussed here. They were not terribly interested in the great mystery of God. They are not terribly interested in being close to a resurrected Christ. They were quite content to be in some spiritual heaven instead, being rather dull to the sharing of the blood and body of Christ. They were soggy because they preferred worldly jealousy and quarreling, and jealousy over who was the greater mentor, whether Paul or Apollos was the greater mentor, whatnot. And there's a lot of discussion over which word should be used here, whether the word worldly or fleshly should be used here. Worldly is probably not a good word. That is not being used anymore. That was used back in the King James. It's not a good word anymore. Even the word fleshly is not a good word anymore. So most critics anymore recognize that it should be, the word that should be used here is of the flesh instead. And as you can see in the manuscript there, it basically says of the flesh rather than fleshly. It certainly doesn't say world there. And what's the difference here? What is the difference between of the flesh or fleshly mean. The difference meaning that those Corinthians were not necessarily non-Christian, even though they might have had some pretty skewed beliefs.